June 22, 1965. Perhaps I might begin today by recalling the distinction I tried to make at the beginning of these lectures, in order to show you what is specific to metaphysics. 4. If I could make a methodological point straight away, it is not enough, when defining the meaning of a concept of such historical depth as that of metaphysics, to outline the main areas of subject matter within it, or its essential content and the way in which it is treated. Even the understanding of concepts includes a moment of negation, in that, to understand a philosophy, for example, one needs to know what its specific rhetoric was really directed against. If one seeks to understand a philosophy purely from within itself, just from what is written down, one usually does not get very far. One needs to develop a faculty for discerning the emphases and accents peculiar to that philosophy in order to uncover their relationships within the philosophical context, and thus to understand the philosophy itself. That is at least as important as knowing unequivocally such and such is metaphysics. Bearing this in mind, I would remind you that rather than talking about its verbal meaning, I tried to describe metaphysics in a precise sense as the unity of a critical and rescuing intention. 1. That is to say that metaphysics is always present where enlightened rationalism both criticizes traditional notions and ideas existing in themselves, as mythological, and at the same time, and not just out of an apologetic need, but out of a concern for truth, wants to save or restore these concepts, which reason has demolished, precisely through the application of reason, or even to produce them anew from within its own rational resources. This can be said, for example, of the most famous theory of Aristotle, which concerns us now, the one concerning matter, vin, and form, etus or poppy. After criticizing the Platonic doctrine of ideas, it sought, while remaining aware of this critique and as a consequence of it, to salvage an essential moment of that doctrine, the precedence of the idea, the priority of form. And I repeat that this double-sidedness is prototypical of all metaphysics, even the Kantian, where the famous statement in the Metaphysics that he had set limits to reason in order to make room for faith, and I repeat that this double-sidedness is prototypical of all metaphysics, even the Kantian, where the famous statement in the Metaphysics that he had set limits. And I repeat that this double-sidedness is prototypical of all metaphysics, even the Kantian, where the famous statement in the Metaphysics that he had set limits to reason in order to make room for faith, points to precisely this ambivalence. The intention I am speaking of was given clear expression by Aristotle in the proposition that true knowledge always has as its object the necessary and immutable, as in Plato. 3. You should bear in mind here, however, as in the case of all the concepts of ancient philosophy, that the concept of causality, or of cause, as it appears, in a complex form, in Aristotle, should not be understood as a category founded on subjectivity, but as something inherent in the objective world and indicated by the form of linguistic expression. In contrast to the necessary and immutable, the sensible is treated in Aristotle as fortuitous or inferior, and the case is very similar in Plato. Admittedly, you do not find in Aristotle the Platonic notion of the non-existence of sensible matter. This is clearly connected to his doctrine concerning the relation of form to matter. Nor do you find the doctrine that the sensible, the spatial-temporal, is the absolutely non-existent. But if I could remind you here of the methodological principle that, in philosophy, the problems are to be found in the smallest nuances, it should be noted that, despite this different valuation of the sensible, evaluation generally attributed to Aristotle's tendency towards empiricism in contrast to classical rationalism, this changed position with regard to the sensible is not so far removed from the Platonic doctrine of the non-existent as might first be thought, and as some passages in Aristotle suggest. This is because matter, vin, as the pure possibility of that which is divested of all specific determinants, is seen as the absolutely indeterminate and really as a mere craving for determination, and it is only this striving which qualifies it as possibility, with which matter is equated in Aristotle, so that if one were to take the Hegelian step of saying that the absolutely indeterminate is the same as nothingness, one could find the famous Platonic proposition in Aristotle as well, except that, and this, in my view, demonstrates the splendor and originality of Aristotle's thought, he refused to take this step. And it is one of the most profound and truly dialectical contradictions in Aristotle's philosophy that while savapus, the matter of cognition, is said to be indeterminate, it is not only indeterminate, that he does not adhere to the thesis of the absolute indeterminateness of that which has not yet attained form. Shall take this opportunity to point out something which may help you to gain a somewhat deeper understanding of philosophy than what you read in the textbooks. It is that, in general, one does not understand philosophy by eliminating contradictions. or by chalking up contradictions against authors, there is no significant philosophical author who could not be convicted of this or that contradiction. One understands a philosophy by seeking its truth content precisely at the point where it becomes entangled in so-called contradictions. This is true in the most emphatic way of Aristotle. As far as the sensible in his work is concerned, it is treated as inferior but not as non-existent. In this he has placed himself in what is called the Platonic tradition, and both philosophers contribute to the low valuation of everything sensible which later remained characteristic of idealism in the widest sense. In his formulation, sensible matter could equally well be as not be, infex aminu karin kamin, he says. For what he really has against the merely existent, therefore, is not so much its indeterminateness as what in later philosophy was referred to as its fortuitousness, its contingency. And you will hear later that the notion of the fortuitousness of matter, in contrast to the regularity of form, indeed played a major role in Aristotle under the name of Ro or Operov, and through the use of the old mythological term Zoxt, meaning that history, too, was assigned this major role. Matter, this proposition states, might be or equally well might not be. I should like to point out in passing that this thesis, which actually is one of the invariants occurring throughout metaphysical thinking, is by no means as self-evident as it purports to be. If one were to ask, at the crude, schoolroom level, where one of the main differences between the metaphysical and the anti-metaphysical traditions lies, the answer would probably be that metaphysics places everything in the idea or in reason or, subjectively speaking, in the mind, and therefore values sensible matter, which is genetically connected to case, the material, less highly. I would ask you to reflect for a moment whether this conception is really as compelling as we are generally told, and I would here use the method of immanent criticism, which means taking the a priori idea literally, and asking whether there are not also so-called a priori characteristics of cognition, which are by no means nonsensible in nature. The phenomenological school was the first to point this out, in Husserl, in the doctrine of what he called the contingent a priori, 6 and far more strongly in Max Scheler. 7. According to this doctrine there are also determinants which are valid a priori, that is, absolutely and necessarily, but only on condition that some sensible matter is given. Therefore, although they claim absolute, a priori validity, they depend on something like the existence of the sensible. Examples of this are taken from certain areas of physics and optics. If it is said, for example, that in the optical similarity series violet lies between red and blue, then as long as color sensations of the types blue and red exist it will be impossible, no matter how hard one tries, not to imagine that the color we call violet is anything other than intermediate between the two other colors. We are certainly dealing here, therefore, with an a priori proposition. But it is one which could hardly be called necessary in the strict sense insisted upon by Aristotle, because the fact that on the basis of known nerve processes we see something like red and blue cannot itself be inferred from pure thought, but is a kind of given. I offer this as the simplest possible critique of the assertion made by the metaphysical tradition that the a priori is always purely mental, in order to show you that even if the sphere of the a priori is given the weight it has in the idealist and ontological tendencies, it certainly does not follow that sensible material and sensible relationships should be excluded in the way that that tradition has asserted as self-evident since Plato. 9. But I should like to go beyond this relatively simple insight by pointing out that the absolute separation of the realm of the intelligible or rational from that of the sensible itself contains a certain short-sightedness in its analysis of what is called the mental sphere. By this I refer to the sphere which is generally described as the most abstract of all, that of so-called pure logic. All purely logical propositions contain the concept of a something, a substrate, however constituted, for which they are valid. Without the supposition of such a something, about which, for example, nothing contradictory may be said, to cite the true and unique central proposition of traditional logic, without this substrate, however abstract it may be, no such thing as formal logic is possible. 10. But it does not require great acuity to discover, and I would encourage you to do this for yourselves, as I do not want to take the time to do so here, that within this something, no matter how pale, sublimated, abstract, spiritualized it may be, there is ultimately a reference to some sensible matter. It is doubtless impossible to fulfill this something in any way without recourse to the sensible, if it is to be given any meaning at all, otherwise it would remain permanently within the tautological sphere of mind. And the concept of something no longer has any conceivable meaning in the theory of logical forms. If it is constantly expressed only through forms, it can no longer be grasped at all, although logic remains dependent on this something. If the consideration I have just indicated is correct, it has extraordinarily wide implications for the problem with which we are concerned at present. For it means that even in the most abstract sphere, in which, if anywhere at all, the pure concept of the a priori operates, It is not possible to eliminate the sensible in the manner required by the dichotomy, which is taken for granted by all metaphysics. It means that in order to attain to the most extreme a priori propositions conceivable, the most formal propositions of logic, we always come up against sensible matter in the prolongation of what is meant by the something. Without any sensible matter, therefore, it is impossible to conceive the forms themselves, which would be no more than the working out of the idea that, contrary to Aristotle in that tradition, we can only conceive the so-called principle of form, or any kind of categorical form, as mediated through some content, and not as something absolutely different from it. Form is always the form of something, just as, if you were asked quite simply and naively what a form is, and it is always useful to go back to the simplest cases of linguistic usage to clarify such matters, you would probably say that form is something by which material is formed. This olive green area, let us say, is articulated by the fact that it appears to you as rectangular. It would not occur to you to speak of form independently of its being necessarily the form of something. But in face of this idea embedded in language and in immediate consciousness, metaphysics has remained coy. It has, as it were, kept mum about this moment of the form of what which is implicit not only in form but in the meaning of the concept of form itself. In Kant, the distinction between the non-sensible, which is conceived purely in terms of concepts, and the sensible, which can just as well be as not be, is taken over directly in his distinction between the real and the possible. 11. Only that which is conceived purely in terms of concepts, the thesis runs, is as immutable as the idea. What Aristotle overlooks here, and about which we shall have more to say later, is, first of all, quite simply the abstractive quality of concepts. That is to say that, in order to come into being at all, concepts must refer to something sensible from which they are abstracted. In being abstracted, the concept retains a multiplicity of features common to sense data while excluding those features which are not common to the individual objects subsumed under the concept, in this case mental objects. This moment of abstraction, that the concept is itself mediated by the sensible, is not understood by Aristotle, and here, too, he stands on Platonic ground. Reflection on the act of the subject by which such a thing as an idea or concept comes into being does not take place. 2. Be sure, both thinkers analyze how thought elevates itself to concepts, but here the concept is presupposed as the in itself, and despite all the epistemological reflections to be found in both thinkers, they overlook the fact that the path they describe is not external to the concept, but is a necessary moment of that concept. It is inherent in that concept's meaning and cannot, therefore, be disregarded in considering the concept. In other words, if Aristotle teaches the immanence of the concept in the object, by which he appears to dissolve the abstractness of the concept in relation to what it subsumes, for him this immanence of the concept in the object is ontological, that is, the concept is in itself in the object, without reference to the abstracting subject. True, it is connected to the non-conceptual element within the object in a manner which Aristotle himself never clearly elaborated, and I would even say that it is inseparable from that element. But the real nature of the relationship between the concept and what it refers to in the concrete object is never worked out. The reason is that the concept is conceived as something existing in itself, which, in a sense, migrates into the real object, where it is amalgamated with the sensible material. To characterize once more the difference between the Aristotelian immanence of the concept and a dialectical view, one might perhaps use a scientific image and say that in Aristotle the relationship of concept to concrete things is that of an amalgam and not of a chemical compound, in which the two apparently antithetical moments or elements are so fused that one cannot exist without the other. The interest which motivated Aristotle in arriving at this interpretation was really an interest in change. And one might discern a very fundamental step in the development from Plato to Aristotle in the fact that while Aristotle, too, located truth in the immutable, he was nevertheless interested in change, attempting to grasp in it relation to the unchanging, whereas in Plato any interest in change lay far in the background. In Aristotle, therefore, as is almost always the case with advancing enlightenment and differentiation, thought became incomparably more dynamic than in Plato. And it can now be said, if I might for a moment describe the trajectory of Aristotle's metaphysics from this aspect, that Aristotle's work is an attempt to bring together the motif of form with that of change, which he no longer denies but analyses. To be sure, form is still regarded as that which exists in itself and ranks higher. In this, Aristotle takes the entirely traditional view that form, eve pura, is superior because it is lasting, unchanging and purer. It could also be said that Aristotle attempts to discover how the idea of the eternally immutable, as the higher, is to be synthesized with that of the mutable, as that which presents itself to us empirically. And here Aristotle arrives at an extraordinarily important and profound insight, that all change presupposes something unchangeable, and all becoming something that has not become. It might be doubted, and this doubt is, if you like, the quintessence of Kant's critique of metaphysics, whether the conclusion drawn from becoming to something which has not become, and from change to the unchanging, is legitimate. But first, before dealing with that question, it should be noted that this conclusion contains the implicitly dialectical view that the notion of something dynamic, of change, of becoming, is impossible without reference to something fixed. This is, I would say in passing, one of Aristotle's most magnificent discoveries, to which we are hardly able to give its due weight because it has become so self-evident to us that we no longer know what an enormous exertion of genius its attainment must have cost. The idea that there can be no mediation without the immediate, though also, of course, no immediacy without mediation, and that there is no movement which is not the movement of something which, relative to it, has a moment of fixity, later became the central proposition of dialectical philosophy, or one of its key tenets. And this idea, that we cannot imagine change except in relation to something fixed, was conceived, as far as I am aware, by Aristotle, unless one interprets certain tendencies in Plato's late dialogues in this sense, on which point, given the highly controversial character of the Parmenides dialogue in particular, I would not presume to pass judgment in face of the conclusions of conventional philologists. I did say, however, that in Aristotle there is a kind of short circuit or false conclusion at this point. It is the supposition that, because every change needs something fixed, or all becoming something which has become, this fixed thing must be absolutely unchangeable. This false assumption, which is one of the main concerns in Kant's critique and the doctrine of antinomies, 12 is always taken at face value, as one of the antitheses of the transcendental dialectic. I believe you can only understand how Aristotle arrived at this curious conclusion if you bear in mind that the concept of the infinite was foreign to antiquity, and that really means to ancient mathematics. I am aware that this statement, like all such statements, can be met with counterexamples. I also know that in ancient mathematics there were early forms of infinitesimal calculus. And in one of the next lectures, we shall have occasion to note 3, that Aristotle sometimes uses the concept of the non-limited, which goes back to the Eretprov of Anaximander. 14. Despite this, I believe it is legitimate to maintain that the permeation of the whole of consciousness by the notion of infinity, and the distinction between the finite and the infinite, as presupposed by the concept of transcendence in monotheistic religions, and as buttressed by the hegemony of infinitesimal mathematics in the modern natural sciences, that all this was alien to antiquity. If you will concede this for a moment, and I think one may concede it without doing too much violence to the texts, you will readily understand that precisely such determinants as that of an absolute cause, and all the categories which for us have the character of the transcendent, that is, which can only be posited in infinity, in accordance with our whole education and our habits of thought, become in his thought determinants of the finite, simply because the world is finite, and because infinity, or the idea that the world is absolutely unlimited, is entirely foreign to his thinking. And I would say that the fact that ontology, by its nature, posits mental categories as absolutely valid is connected with this constitutive character of finitude, since these categories are themselves conceived within a finite realm, within a closed world, whereas there is no space for them in the open world, blown apart by the concept of infinity, in which we have lived, to an increasing degree, for almost 400 years. To that extent it might be said that ontology, as the attempt to encompass something infinite with finite determinants, itself has something archaic about it, that it is something which, in some sense, has been left behind by the development of mind towards the present concept of the infinite. However, if one were to review and analyze the history of philosophy from this perspective, one would come across countless archaisms of this kind, a fact which, paradoxically enough, has been repeatedly emphasized by the opposite position, the school of Heidegger. Although there it is seen as something positive, what must be noted, therefore, is, firstly, that one can only speak of change with reference to something fixed, and, secondly, that the positive tendency of metaphysics stems from the fact that infinity was alien to antiquity. For this reason, relationships or categories which we can no longer imagine except in terms of the infinite, and therefore as transcendent, were turned in antiquity into relationships of finitude. I would only add that the switch role the concept of infinity in later philosophy is, of course, connected to the increased prominence given to the knowing subjectivity, the spirit. Since the spirit was defined from the first as something infinite in itself, in contrast to the finitude of the diversity to which it is related. Now this doctrine of immutability, with the connected notion that all mutability finally goes back to something immutable, has survived throughout the history of metaphysics, to the point that it became the subject of Kant's third antinomy. 15. And it has also had incalculable consequences for theology, since Aristotelian theology really has its center in this. doctrine, in the form of the doctrine of the unmoved mover of all things. 16. The unmoved mover is, fundamentally, nothing other than pure form existing in itself, which, as it were, draws everything up towards it. Although itself immobile, it is like a magnet of pure actuality, or pure energy, pulling up everything which is merely potential towards it and, in this way, realizing itself to an ever-increasing degree. That, really, is the core of Aristotle's metaphysics, if the core is defined as the point at which his metaphysics passes over into theology. The central point of any metaphysics is probably to be found where the transition between metaphysics and theology takes place. 17. And it takes place precisely in this relationship of the immobile to motion, to which it is mediated by the fact that it draws everything which merely exists to itself. And, in a sense, motion is already latent in the merely existent, since the latter, as potentiality, has within itself the ability to move towards the most perfect and highest order of being. The idea of the analogia entis, the analogy between the creature and the creator, 18 is thus already sketched out, if you like, in this theory of Aristotle. Aristotle's metaphysics therefore raises a further question, the question of what the unchanging, or that which has not become, actually is. And this gives rise to two categories which have had a decisive influence on the subsequent history of Western metaphysics, the concepts of substance and accidents. These two concepts will be examined in the next lecture. June 24, 1965. We now have to consider the question of what the unchanging, or that which has not become, which might be called the ontological residue in Aristotle's ontology, actually is. In seeking an answer we come across two determinants which cannot be resolved into each other, and which are thus the source of the dualism which has exerted a crucial influence on the whole history of Western philosophy. On the one hand we have the substrate, which is subject to change, and on the other the properties. Change consists in the communication of properties to the substrate. But the properties, to make you aware of this straight away, are not regarded as something transient and secondary, but as constant, unchanging, something which has not become. And indeed, it is on these properties that Aristotelian philosophy placed the greatest emphasis throughout its development, and to which it attached the gravest importance. That, then, is the origin of the dualism which has been predominant throughout the Western tradition, which was first expressed through the concepts of the substantial and the accidental, then became central to medieval philosophy, including its terminology. And from there passed over into the rationalist philosophy of Descartes, Spinoza and Leibniz. We now know that these philosophers represent two things, both the nominalist protest against scholasticism, and a direct continuation of the Aristotelian scholastic problematic. Such is the complexity of the history of philosophy, which escapes any simple formula, what I just now called the substrate, and which I ask you to distinguish from substance. Please forgive the pedantry, but not for nothing are we nearing the realm of scholasticism, where it is impossible to manage with a certain measure of subtlety in the definition of terms. The substrate, then, is what Aristotle calls matter or stuff, in Greek van, translated into Latin as materia. The term was taken up again by the phenomenological school to designate the material element, irreducible to meaning or intention, in the facts of consciousness, and is probably familiar to you from there. But in Aristotle it has not this subjective, epistemological meaning but a thoroughly objective, ontological one. Here you must distinguish terminologically, to reiterate the point in order to eliminate any confusion, between nulli and ovula. Ovula means true being and refers, on the one hand, to the determinate, individual thing and, on the other, to popin, form, or eldos, essence in the Platonic sense, whereas van, as something universal and indeterminate, represents neither this specific thing here, toti, nor, on the other hand, the general, ideal quality of the form or the pops. Now the properties which this van takes on are called either eldos, like the Platonic ideas, or popin, meaning much the same as form. I don't attach importance to this terminology for its own sake, but because, without it, I cannot explain a crucial twist in Aristotle's thought, which, I would say, is the most specifically Aristotelian feature of his entire philosophy. For him, the substantial is precisely not what I have just called the substrate, it is not matter. On the contrary, matter and substance are distinguished in his work, if one might express it in modern terms. For Aristotle the substantial is pure form, exactly as the idea is substantial in Plato, while the whole hylach level, matter in the sense of that which is given only in sensible terms, is the non-existent, unov. And this peculiar twist, by which substance is equated with form rather than matter in Aristotle, comes about because the substrate, gen, or matter, is stripped of all determinateness, so that it becomes something entirely empty, and comes extraordinarily close to the non-existent in Plato. This results from a process of reduction through abstraction, although this abstraction is not subjected to any specific critical reflection in Aristotle's objectively orientated philosophy. This in turn gives rise to a paradox, an idea running counter to all popular notions, which has dominated the whole of metaphysical consciousness to the point where it has become a kind of second nature to thought. It is the idea that form, which might be thought to be ephemeral and unreal, something merely conceptual and pale, in contrast to the real and tangible solidity of matter, is made into the true reality, in contrast which at least to begin with, the other, hilix stratum. Matter as the substrate of cognition, is reduced to something in the strict sense unreal, mere potentiality. You can already find here, to draw your attention to what I regard as a crucial connection in the history of philosophy, the principle of idealism, by which the mental appears as the truly real, while that which is given by the senses, the sensible object of experience, is seen as less real. A mere function. The ramifications of this principle are still seen in the positivist conceptions of Hume or Ernst Mach. To this extent, therefore, Aristotelian philosophy is idealistic, in the precise sense I have just defined, that a higher order of reality is attributed to forms than to their content. But this is a very peculiar kind of idealism, in that it is really an objective idealism, an idealism conceived only with regard to the objects of knowledge, but not, or not essentially, with reference to the thinking subject. However, because the forms, or elan, to which a higher order of reality is ascribed, are the forms or properties of something, they are not, as in Plato, simply being in itself, but are always mediated by that of which they are the forms. A circumstance which I pointed out to you in one of the last lectures has therefore made itself felt in Aristotle's thought, that we cannot speak of a form without saying, the form of something. We do not speak of form as such, but of the form of a painting, of a piece of music, or, to use this frightful example once more, the form of this blackboard. At this point, therefore, Aristotle's reflections are extraordinarily complicated. On the one hand, the Platonic doctrine that ideas or forms have being in themselves is maintained, in the sense that reality, or at any rate, higher reality, is attributed only to them, but, on the other hand, this reality is not susceptible to thought, or only within that in which it is realized. This makes the question of the realization of form the central problem. For while form is regarded as the higher reality in that which has true being in itself, nevertheless, it has this being only within matter. Thus, the truly fundamental problem of Aristotle's philosophy becomes the question of the realization of form. And this question is, at the same time, none other than the question about change, which relates both to the effect of form on matter and to matter itself, and finally, to the relation between the two. Aristotle's position on this point is an extremely advanced one, in that he not only recognizes these two poles of being, as we might call them, but also subjects their relationship to analysis, and in that his philosophy, as a theory of invariance, now has its point of attack in precisely this relationship between its two opposite poles. Or form without matter, the goal, or realis, of becoming or change is that matter should take on form. This concept of telos, or final purpose, has become perhaps the most fertile of all Aristotle's concepts for philosophy, since it is the origin of the distinction between cause and purpose. Purpose is defined for the first time as the higher category, which draws the lower towards it, in contrast to cause, or causes, which are said to be effective only in the lower realm, the realm of matter. The whole problematic of the relation of cause to purpose, which is, of course, the theme of Kant's third critique, the critique of judgment, and the entire subject matter of teleology, whether we should think of an entity in a causal, mechanical way, or from the standpoint of that towards which it tends, its higher destiny. Therefore it has its origin in this basic Aristotelian doctrine, which can really be called the core of the metaphysics. From it Aristotle derives, as the crux of his metaphysics, at the center of which we find ourselves now, a theory which runs exactly counter to naive intuition. If we leave aside speculations like those of Heraclitus or the Eleatics, this is the first time that philosophy has placed itself in direct opposition to so-called natural common sense. This is especially out of keeping with a scientifically conceived philosophy like Aristotle's, which otherwise gives so much scope to common sense. This theory states that form is the true reality. To express it, Aristotle uses specific terms which have become famous, such as energia or intellectia, and also rho epipelov, meaning that which must come into being through energy, through form. For him, therefore, reality is actually energy, it is reality only insofar as it is formed reality, and it is not the material of that reality. Matter, by contrast, is defined as mere possibility or potentiality, because it must always have within it the possibility of attaining such reality, of attaining its form, its popon. Matter is therefore called suvermus, which is very peculiar, since, following the Greek meaning of the word, we associate subquis with the concept of force. But here solvabus means the same as possibility. It is, therefore, precisely not the static and unchanging entity that we might associate with the concept of matter, but is, as the word indicates, a dynamic principle. If I might give you a cross-reference to the later history of philosophy, this doctrine of Aristotle's is a speculation which reappeared at the height of German idealism, in Schelling, where matter is likewise conceived, in an objective dialectic, as a principle which has the inherent tendency to move towards a higher form, except that in Schelling this comes about in the light of a subjective reflection which has already taken place. 2. That is to say that in Schelling the spirit of matter is already seen as the absolute subject of reflection which, of course, cannot be present in Aristotle. I repeat, therefore, form is reality, vapira, while matter is mere possibility, savragus. It could therefore be said that Aristotle's metaphysics is an idealism which has not yet reflected on itself, an objective idealism. However, the mediation of form and matter, which follows from this concept of reality, is not really carried through by Aristotle. I have already stated this in principle but would like to recapitulate it at this point. Although the two terms, form and matter, are related to each other, this is done only externally, through the capacity of matter to become something other than it is. That is to say, it is not itself always also form. It is not mediated within itself by form. As a result, despite the anti-Platonic twist, form becomes once again something existing in itself, whereas, according to a consistent theory of mediation, it would be dependent on matter. We are presented with the paradox that although form, according to its own concept, can only be the form of something, it now becomes, as the logical conclusion of Aristotle's thought, absolute reality. And, as a result of the same unmediated dogmatism, possibility becomes an equally paradoxical concept. Pure possibility is, of course, a formal determinant in which thought and categorization are implicit. In Aristotle's philosophy it is only conferred on matter, vin, through form. Yet the fact that something contains the possibility of becoming something else is now attributed roid as if it were a property before all determination, residing in matter as such. This attribution has the most far-reaching consequences for the formulation of the concept of matter in Aristotle, in particular the consequence I have already mentioned, that as Aristotle's philosophy is elaborated matter ceases to be the indeterminate, empty entity which it initially appears to be according to the logic of this philosophy, and becomes, it must be said, the very thing from which he had so assiduously distinguished it, a kind of substance. Now, I have mentioned these critical misgivings because a philosophy cannot be understood without thinking it through critically. To seek to understand something in philosophy without at the same time criticizing it is, in my view, an impossible procedure, and I suspect that whenever a distinction is made between understanding and criticism, there is some kind of authoritarian demand behind it. First make sure you have understood, and by then you will be rid of all your critical quibbles. That is such folly, I think, because philosophical propositions are always put forward with a claim to truth, and can only be understood by reconstructing this claim to truth. But that can only be done by including in the analysis what I have just called criticism, by questioning their truth. The idea that one could understand any philosophical idea without criticism, without questioning its truth, I regard as methodologically quite untenable. That is why, in expounding Aristotle's metaphysics for you, I always present its salient points, and thus the essential problems arising from it, in the form of a critique. Now the critique I have just summarized for you is no great feat for a consciousness versed in epistemology and logic. Yet I should like to say that at the very point where Aristotle's work provokes, if you like, our strongest dissent, it nevertheless contains an extraordinary amount of truth. And, having made no secret of the criticism, I would say that it is more important that you should be aware of this truth than that you should write down at this point that Aristotle has perpetrated this or that error, which we, having made such wonderful progress since then, can mark down against him and thereby dispose of the matter. The history of philosophy is not so simple. It is, on the contrary, remarkably complex, in the sense that while it moves through the medium of criticism, and while false ideas are certainly refuted by criticism, this refutation almost never has the effect of disposing of them entirely. Rather, philosophical questions are always a bit like those self-righting toys, seeming to be knocked over but reappearing in changed historical philosophical constellations, demanding an answer. And I believe that anyone who wants to understand what philosophy signifies as history of the mind, should be aware of this curious ambiguity, on the one hand, the critical attitude towards philosophy, and between philosophies, and on the other the fundamentally open character of philosophical questions, which cannot be definitively disposed of by such criticism. One needs to be aware of this if one is not to succumb, on the one hand, to a naive rationalism with regard to the history of philosophy, or, on the other, to an equally naive belief in an eternal conversation of philosophical minds carried on down the millennia. which has nothing to do with history. Neither view is correct, and both these extremes are intermingled in the history of philosophy in a way which is very difficult, and perhaps impossible, to define in abstract terms. Coming now to the truth content of this doctrine of Aristotle's, I would like to point out that in Kant, where possibility is placed squarely on the side of form, something said by Aristotle is misunderstood, as it is in the whole of epistemology, and only reappears in Hegel's dialectic. It might indeed be no bad way to present the Hegelian dialectic if one were to see it as a renewal of the controversy between Kant and Aristotle on a higher level, a view, incidentally, which finds plentiful support in Hegel's own history of philosophy. For Aristotle's definition of matter as potentiality contains something which can perhaps be seen as the real foundation, or, in medieval language, the fundamentum in re, of every synthesis. Here is the idea that every form depends on its material as much as the material depends on the form, whereas we, influenced by the Copernican revolution brought about by Kant and the ensuing development, have all been trained to see matter as conditioned, so to speak, by form, and to believe that spirit lays down the laws followed by nature, as Kant put it in his famous formulation of this inversion. For according to this doctrine of Aristotle's, there is no categorical form to which there is not a corresponding moment in matter which calls for it. Aristotle knew, and I do not think this can be emphasized enough, that so-called syntheses, that is, the bringing together of facts and concepts, judgments and conclusions, are not mere adjuncts, or pure operations of the subject of cognition, but are only possible if there is something corresponding to them in that to which they are applied, that is, in matter. If you judge that 4 plus 3 equals 7, this contains not only the synthetic function of the consciousness which brings these moments together, but also a real, factual basis on which this kind of synthesis can be made. Admittedly, it does so in a manner which implies that without the synthetic judgment which brings 3 and 4 together, we should know nothing of that factual basis, so that the synthesis is a necessary part of it. On the other hand, however, this synthesis would not be possible, and the statement 3 plus 4 equals 7 would be false, if a factual moment, which admittedly is inseparable from the synthesis, were not already contained in the material being judged. That is not expressed by Aristotle in the epistemological form I have chosen for it here, but it does appear in his work in the form of a doctrine of substance. This states that two essences, which are posited absolutely as principles, the essence und and the essence Essenspaten, must always come together in order that such a thing as reality can exist. But he was the first to see that, in this interrelatedness, form despite its self-sufficiency, which he emphasized just as much as Plato, can only be the form of reality if there is something corresponding to it in reality itself. And that is Aristotle's outstanding discovery, which I consider more important than the hypostasis of the two merely additively connected categories, Uan and Papen, which he used to illustrate this point. Now, to take this further, matter without any form, pure matter, if one might put it like that, is called by Aristotle first matter, Uln, and this is the point where the concept of Orepov, the unbounded, appears in his work. But this Stretpov does not refer to anything that we might remotely equate with the modern concept of infinity, but means simply that any determination of an object is a wetpap, a bounding of that object, whereas purely, Greek letter omicron pyrwatili, which is absolutely without any such restriction, has no boundary, since it is absolutely indeterminate. 6. However, and this is crucial, this having no boundary is not interpreted in his thought, as it is in the whole of modern philosophy, as something transcendent, going beyond the possibility of contingent experience, in keeping with the modern interpretation of infinity. Exactly the opposite is the case in Aristotle, for whom marive, because it lacks bounding, is something impoverished which needs its form. For Greek thought, therefore, the infinite, if such an idea is conceived at all, is a mere scandal, something repugnant which still lacks its destiny, its form. Oswald Spengler noted in this context that for antiquity, with its plastic mode of experience, reality lay in the bounding of the infinite by form and not in infinity as such. Despite the barrage of criticism unleashed on Spengler for such remarks, 8. What he says on the central point of Aristotle's philosophy seems to me by no means as perverse as people are apt to insist in polite society. One might ask, of course, whether this concept of matter, of absolutely unformed TTOWTYUAT, is not itself, as a concept, a form, for by speaking of matter as an DPXN with acute, a principle. I have already abstracted from the immediacy of matter itself and reduced it to its most general concept, so that if Aristotle speaks, as I have just done, of pure matter, of pure nulli which has absolutely no form, he is actually contradicting himself, since speech about it is itself something formed. While I shall not keep this criticism to myself, I would again point out that, with important thinkers, the real problems are located where they make so-called errors, and that nothing is more foolish than to dismiss them by pointing out those errors, as I have just done. For one must be on one's guard against the idealist misconception, especially threatening at this point, that because we cannot speak about anything, or have anything, which is not mediated by form, form must therefore be the only thing which is. Having touched on these matters, I should like to say something about a very basic question of metaphysics which, I realize, goes far beyond the scope of a historical introduction to Aristotle, but concerns a state of affairs which one needs to be aware of if one is to occupy oneself usefully with metaphysical questions today. The fact that, just by talking about matter, one endows this matter with form. That is, conceptual form, should not be confused with the meaning of this form itself. The peculiarity of the concept of I, or matter, is that we are here using a concept or speaking of a principle which, by its meaning, refers to something which is not a concept or a principle. We only correctly understand what a concept such as van means if we realize that its conceptual meaning refers to something non-conceptually. The paradox facing us here is removed if we do not allow ourselves to fetishize the language or conceptual system we use. It is true that we can only speak in a way which is mediated through language, but for that reason language itself, as one phenomenon among others, becomes a part of reality as a whole, a moment of reality, and should not be hypostatized over against it. It is in the nature of language that we can speak of an absolutely formless matter, even though speaking of formless matter is itself a form. It is as if we were in the prison of language, but were able to recognize it as a prison. I have set out this dialectic for you because one believed that philosophizing begins at exactly the point I have just shown you, where one refuses to be fobbed off with curt pronouncements such as that matter as a primary concept or first principle is itself a form. So that the concept of formless matter is meaningless, one actually starts thinking at such points and reflects further on them. And if I had to characterize the difference between the kind of thinking I advocate and positivist thinking, I would say that non-positivist thinking is precisely that which is not content with the rigid logic of exclusivity, the logic of either or, either mediated or immediate, either concept or pure non-conceptuality, but analyzes phenomena in such a way that seemingly self-evident statements like the one I just mentioned grow more and more shaky. What seems to me to be unique about philosophical concepts is that, in face of the despair which philosophy can sometimes induce, they provide, if not the consolation of philosophy, then at least a consolation for philosophy. Philosophy has the curious characteristic that, although itself entrapped, locked inside the glass house of our constitution and our language, it is nevertheless able constantly to think beyond itself and its limits, to think higher self through the walls of its glass house. And this thinking beyond itself, into openness, that, precisely, is metaphysics. June 29, 1965. I have spoken repeatedly in